Could there be a thaw in the trade war between the United States and China? Hello, I'm Arnand Naidu, and this is The Heat. U.S. President Donald Trump says he had a good conversation with Chinese President Xi Jinping on Thursday about bilateral trade and the upcoming G20 summit. The leaders are expected to have face-to-face talks in Argentina later this month in hopes of resolving major trade issues. Since July, the United States has imposed tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods, and China has responded with tariffs on $110 billion worth of U.S. goods. On Thursday, China also cut import tariffs on nearly 1,600 goods in a move that's expected to open up its economy and save consumers billions of dollars. For more on the U.S.-China trade dispute and what happens next, let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from Beijing is Chen Chenchen. She's the Deputy Director of the Department of Macroeconomics at Renmin University. Here in the studio is Arthur Dong. He's a professor at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Also with us is Merrill Matthews. He's a resident scholar at the Institute for Policy Innovation in Dallas. And Afshin Molavi is a senior fellow with the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Chen Chenchen, let me start with you. So the two leaders had a telephone call, President Trump and President Xi Jinping. President Trump saying afterwards that they had a long and very good conversation. The emphasis was on trade. What do you read into this telephone call and the president's comments afterwards?
Okay, I do think this phone call is giving positive signals on the one hand, because the channel for the very top two leaders' communication is quite open and direct, and they are collaborating on a potential meeting during the G20 summit in Argentina. So you can see that actually the both sides are making efforts to make sure that there isn't a spillover into a systematic risk. But on the other hand, I would also like to say if there are any trade consultations resulting from this phone call, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, because the structural change in Sino-US relationship is already there. And if you read the latest reports from Washington in 2018, including the nuclear posture review and also the national defense strategy, you can see that the U.S. is seriously reconsidering its engagement policy with Beijing. And we talked to lots of scholars, research fellows, and people close to Washington government. We can find that even if it's not the Trump administration, the U.S.-China policy will also will only get tougher in the mid and long term. So I wouldn't say that I'm optimistic toward any potential trade talks. Anand?
Merrill Matthews, there we heard positive signals coming out of this telephone conversation, but as Chen Chenchen pointed out to us, we'll have to wait and see what happens. You know, at times the language that President Trump has used has been very belligerent, very hostile language, especially when he talks about China, he talks about trade. Although he says that he has a very good personal relationship with President Xi Jinping. But now we get this telephone call, conciliatory language. What did you make of it?
Well, I wouldn't limit his belligerent talk to President Xi. A lot of people are the recipient of that. But I was glad to hear it, but I wasn't entirely surprised. The stock market has been in a real tumble over the month of October. That's not unusual in the U.S., but investors are very concerned about the ability to be able to China and the president to be able to come to some kind of agreement. The president's facing a tough election issue coming up here next week, and I think he wanted to try to give the stock market at least a boost right now, and it has been taking a couple of upticks this week, and I think that probably helps. So my guess is he wants to try to come to some kind of agreement down there, but he wanted to try to signal to the markets and the voters that things may be looking up.
Arthur, there have been fears that China and the United States could get involved in a very long and a very damaging trade war. It'll be damaging to both sides. Do you detect that both sides have recognized that this could be damaging, and they're now we're seeing the beginning of some serious efforts to prevent that happening? Yes, absolutely. I would agree with our previous speakers, Merrill and Chen, as well, that this is a very positive first step towards dialogue, thoughtful dialogue with regard to the issues that are before the United States and China. Now, there are very big issues in front of these two countries,
And at least this sets the stage for a meeting in Argentina while they meet at the G20 to at least begin an open dialogue that would probably give some hope to the rest of the world that some of these issues might have some opportunity to be resolved.
Afshin, I'm wondering how much of what we're hearing right now is politics. You know, as Arthur just told us, we have an election next week, the midterms,
Right.
very important election. Because on the one hand, we hear President Trump talk about his great personal relationship, his rapport with President Xi Jinping. And then on the other hand, in fact, you could hear it in the same hour, he will talk about China abusing the United States, draining its economy, as he put it. Is it politics that he's playing here?
Certainly, there's some politics. I mean, this is, after all, Washington, and you know, where it's an art form. But having said that, I think President Trump, he is stuck in an old view of China. China as the factory of the world. China as the country that the United States runs trade deficits with. But you know who's not stuck in that old view? Starbucks and Coca-Cola and Nestle and and Johnson & Johnson and big American companies that are trading with China, investing in China. I mean, the great story of the 21st century has been the China demand engine that is demanding commodities. China is the largest importer of U.S. oil. For example, and I think that there are people that are in the Chamber of Commerce crowd in the United States, business lobbies that are getting that message across. And as Merrill said, if President Trump won't listen to them, at least he's listening to the stock market. And as the stock market falls, I think we're going to see this sort of talk. But fundamentally, it's going to be hard to get him away from that old view of China.
So do I mean, this is the party of business that he represents, doesn't he?
It is, but this is a new Republican Party, and this is a president that doesn't always align with that old Republican Party.
Right, Chen Chenchen, let's look at some of the developments that have come out of Beijing. China has decided to cut tariffs on 1,600 goods, including textiles, metals, steel actually is in there as well. What's behind that move?
Well, on the one hand, of course, it's part of the countermeasures in the context of the ongoing Sino-U.S. trade dispute, because when the U.S. Is pursuing this trade protectionism, of course, the Chinese industries, especially those who are quite sensitive to the price increase due to the increased tariffs, increased customs, would of course be highly affected, including like toys industry, clothes industry, and also some construction equipment industry. So you need to proactively find new destinations or to consolidate the relationship, especially the trade ties with the rest of the world. But on the other hand, if you follow China's moves very closely, you'll find that actually in the past more than 1 decade since China's entry into WTO, is sticking to the principle that it needs to keep lowering its import tariffs from other countries, because this is the only way you are going to expand your, stimulate your export expansion. So just this year, this is already the 3rd time that China imposed these tariff cuts. So I would say China is also giving out the strong signal that it is still sticking to the principle of opening up around.
Merrill Matthews, if we look at the latest move by the Chinese Trade Ministry to cut tariffs on these imports, does that go some way to addressing one of the main complaints from the United States, and that is that that China was closed to much of American business?
It's not entirely clear to me that it does. It has decided to cut these tariffs. That's good for Chinese consumers. But just if a husband and wife are having a disagreement, it's not necessarily helpful for the husband to go out of his way to be very nice to other women in efforts to try to show that he can be. So I'm not sure that that's that helpful. And the bigger issue, I think, here is not so much the tariffs, but the intellectual property protection and the tech transfer concerns. That, I think, is really looming large in the U.S., probably larger than the tariffs, and they want to try to address that. And I think that's actually going to be a harder issue to address.
Arthur, if we look at the move by the Chinese, I mean, is it a little bit counterintuitive? Because the United States imposes tariffs on Chinese imports as punishment, but on the other hand, China is cutting tariffs.
Yeah, I think this the latest move by China of cutting tariffs on these 1,600 products. I think it does have a stimulating effect with regard to the domestic economy. I see China pivoting, in other words, where they're going to sort of emphasize the domestic consumption, raise the domestic consumption to offset the effects of these tariffs. And so we saw that previously with the reduction in taxation, both corporate and personal. Now we see a reduction of tariffs on a number of imported products to help ostensibly the Chinese consumer. We see bank limitations in terms of capital requirements on the part of banks being lowered. So the president, China's president, is imposing a wide variety of measures to help stimulate the domestic economy in order to prepare itself for what could be a long trade war.
Afshin, I want to get, sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I was going to say, just to add to that, and what we're seeing in China, to the point of stimulating the economy, it's not just the old model of using investment to stimulate the economy. It's some of these other measures, but also what we've seen over the past year is consumption is driving growth in China, and that's an important change, because it used to be the old model was always investment driving growth in China, and when consumption drives growth, that means there's a lot of Starbucks coffees, a lot of Boeing airplanes that can be sold, a lot of Johnson & Johnson products can be sold. And that's where I think President Trump is kind of a little bit behind the curve.
I just want to get back to something that Merrill Matthews said a moment ago, and that is the technology transfer issue. How big an obstacle is that?
It's a big obstacle, and I think it's an important one, an intellectual property issue. But you can address those issues without igniting a whole trade war. But you can address those issues on a discrete basis, looking at them specifically, but you don't have to have this entire trade war that spooks markets, particularly when you do things like you cut the corporate tax rate and you engage in some business deregulation, which has unleashed the animal spirits of the U.S. economy, and then this trade war kind of counteracts those animal spirits that were unleashed.
Right, Chen Chenchen.
And I agree with that completely.
Right.
Yeah.
Chen Chenchen, is there similar thinking in China that we don't have to engage in this trade war with the United States right now? We need to address this technology transfer issue. Is there a plan in place?
Yes, I do think so, because we hold lots of seminars and also discussions with government leaders, and we can see that if you purely look at it in a technical issue, these technical issues can all be solved. We can solve them case by case, item by item, industry by industry. That's not a problem, and this is also a consensus among the people in Washington we talk to. But the bigger issue here is that behind it, the current U.S. government is requiring more. Not just superficially, it's about the technical transfer, but more broadly, it's more about China's rise. So this mentality, if that consists, I wouldn't say there'll be much room for China to compromise. That's why I'm not quite optimistic.
Right. Chen Chenchen, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, he met with a delegation of United States senators. Most of these senators did come from the Republican Party. They had a meeting to discuss these trade issues. Both sides addressed the media afterwards. Let's listen to what they had to say. This is Premier Li first.
I hope China and the U.S. will meet each other halfway and will appropriately handle their differences with mutual respect and equal cooperation. We have the capability and the wisdom to overcome barriers and push China-U.S. relations back to a normal track. This isn't just beneficial for both countries, but also the world.
Your country and our country are competitors, but not adversaries. And we believe that with mutual respect, we can continue to prosper together.
So, Chen Chenchen, what did you make of that?
Well, I read the lines very carefully, the dialogue between Li Keqiang and also Senate Alexander. I would say that it's actually quite positive to hear such talks, such consensus that China and the U.S. has been maintained for more than 4 decades until now. There used to be this very strong consensus that the two powers can maintain this win-win situation, and they have to benefit from this openness, from embracing each other. But now this talk is especially precious given the context of the ongoing trade issue and also the Trump's tough rhetoric about taking jobs back and prioritizing China as a major threat. So I would say that I hope this kind of talk could take an upper hand more or less in the near future or in the midterm. I hope that the bilateral relationship between the two countries can come back to a normal track. Anand.